In this video, we are going to use the binding engine to facilitate changes to the UI. I have two buttons, one make red, the other one make blue. When I click on the blue button, I want this div to be blue. When I click on the make red button, I want this div to be blue as well. I have a red and blue class that will do that for me, so I want to change this color or change the class of this div when I click on these buttons without having to write any JavaScript for it. And you can also see that this button is marked as active, and the active button has this bluish gray background with a white text. And depending on the button that I click on, if the color is blue, then the make blue button is the active button, and so this styling also needs to be updated, preferably without using any manual coding for that. So let's start plugging some of this functionality and see how we can make this work. Before we dive in too quickly, let's quickly add a debug div for us. So we're just going to say div, and I'm going to have a property called status. So I just want to put my status property over here, and I want to set it so that when I click on these buttons, I will change that status property. And to do so, we can make use of the set value expression on the binding engine on each individual button. I've added a click event on both, but instead of using call, this time we're using the word set value. Note that the V is a capital V. And the expression within this is like a normal JavaScript assign statement, where we're saying, I want to go and set a property called status, and it is equal to a string value called red, and I'm doing exactly the same thing with blue. So when I click on the status button, what I should see is a toggling between red and blue. Here is our UI. Let's click on the blue button. Alright, it says blue, click on the red, and we can see it's red. So we can see that we've set the status property to either red or blue, and we still don't have any JavaScript that we have written. The next thing we're going to do is set the active class based on if the status is red or blue. If the status is red, then this button should be the active button, and if the status is blue, then this button should be the active button. To do that, we can use the standard class list binding that we've looked at before. You can see that we've now added the class list expression with an if statement to say if the status is equal to a string red, which is what we're setting over here, then I want this button to contain the class active. If this expression fails, it will not contain the active class. And the same we're doing on the second button, except we're doing the check on the blue. So if the status is blue, then add the active class to this button, otherwise it won't be there. Here is our UI. If I click on the red button, all of a sudden you can see the active button or the active class appears, and our button is blue. And then when I click on the blue button, it makes that the active one. And so, very simply, we could change the class list of the buttons without actually having to write any code. At this point of time, you could have guessed to say, yes, but we can do exactly the same here for our container. So we can take the class list out, replace that with the if, and say if the status is equal to red, then I want this to be red, else I want this to be blue. Let's go see if this actually worked. When I start the application, I can see that the default is blue, which means that our expression did fire because our status hasn't been set yet, so it's defaulting to blue. When I click on the red button, it turns red, and when I click on the blue button, it turns blue, because the class changes as I click on the button. The next thing we need to do is we actually need to give it a bit of a default value, And unfortunately for that, we are going to have to write just a little bit of JavaScript. In our preload, we set the status property to red. That means when I start the application, it will automatically be red instead of blue. Here is the UI. Let's click on the refresh button, and you can see it is still red, and it still changes the color appropriately. There's one more thing that I want to show you with regards to this, in case there is some other functionality that you want to perform when the status changes. In the JavaScript, we added the status changed function using the convention of the property name with the word changed behind it. You get the new value and the old value, and in this case, the stuff that we want to do when we click on the status, when we click on the button changing the status, so we're just going to console log out some arbitrary message. When we started the application, we can see that this has already fired for us, which indicates to us when we set the status on the preload, that function got called to say, please note status has changed, it is now red. When I click on the blue button, it'll fire that function again, the value now being blue, and if I click on the red button, the function will fire again, now being the red. To summarize, instead of having a click.call where we type all the code manually, we're using click.setValue that sets the status property to red or to blue depending on which button we're clicking on. We have a class list if binding to say that if the status is red, I want to make this button my active button, and the same applies for this case except for the blue. And then we also have a classless if binding for our container here that changes its state. So where this becomes really useful is if I change the layout drastically, as an example, I can put the layout in my relevant classes and see that layout actually applied depending on the toggle that I'm using here. Then on the JavaScript side, remember just to set a default value. It kind of helps with the whole process. And then if you want to write code, if the status changes, the standard methodology of the property and changed value methods that you can create to do that.